Wonderful. And then I'll let you two go ahead and get started.
Okay, thank you for having us today. We have had quite the eventful day here in Kentucky, Western Kentucky, where we are at Murray State University. We just came out of hiding from a tornado warning about half an hour ago. They say we're in the all clear, so we're going on as if everything is normal. If we run out of the room, you know why. You'll hear the sirens blaring first, but we're gonna look on the bright side today. So I am Amanda Joyce. I've got a fantastic undergraduate student, senior Erin McDaniel here. And Erin has helped me in data collection for part 2 of a study that started in the fall of 2020. Looking into student characteristics during that first really strange COVID semester. So not the semester where we flipped modalities mid-semester, not that spring semester, but that following fall, when we were just being told this is what students want, this is what students need, but realistically, most of us were flailing about and didn't know what was going on and didn't know what students needed and just kind of making it up as we went. And so I collected some data during that time to see what characteristics students had that were contributing to their learning so that we could try to tailor to students' needs. And Erin, this current semester, this current spring, has helped me to collect part 2 of data to see, are students similar during this semester? Has everybody bounced back from the chaos that we went through? Or is it a little bit tough out there right now? So I'd like to just kind of explore this data with you guys, with Erin popping in with the student perspective on things, what the lived experience was, in addition to her expertise on all of the data that we've got here as well. It's a small bunch today, so if you have any questions, feel free to interrupt us, throw something into the chat, unmute if you need to, but we're just here to dive in and look through some of this. So again, the goal today is to try to figure out what the unique learning circumstances have been, both kind of at the beginning of being thrust into a virtual learning environment that many people weren't prepared for, and now that things have settled a little bit, understanding what's contributing to students' learning, to try to discuss the ways in which we can tailor our courses to meet students' needs. So a bit of background on all of this is that we know that the transition to college can be challenging. Students will often face homesickness. They'll often face a lot of uncertainty in trying to find their identity as they transition, as they move from this top dog phenomenon of they were seniors in high school to they're at the bottom of the food chain here in college. We know the transition is hard, and the research is suggesting that all of these challenges have been magnified since COVID happened. So students who are struggling are disproportionately struggling more. But we also know that there are supports in place that can be helpful. For one, we know that self-regulation can be really helpful. So if we find ways to support students' self-regulation, then they can have more positive experiences as they transition. Now, full disclosure, I'm a developmental psychologist, so I think through that framework. So I very much think in the mindset of what is unique about this period of the lifespan for students. So the majority of our students are hanging out in this place between adolescence and young adulthood, where they're finding their identity, they're figuring out their relationships with other people. Finding your identity is never easy. It comes with a lot of struggles. And oftentimes finding intimacy, relationships with others can be challenging, but so much more so during these last few years when we had lockdowns and people were missing opportunities for socialization, may have missed their prom, that sort of thing. So trying to think in that way, what have students missed? Where are students potentially struggling? Within developmental psychology, we kind of talk about this overlap between adolescence and early adulthood as emerging adulthood. And emerging adulthood is all about having this freedom and being able to be self-focused, but also being pressured in a lot of ways. There's a lot of instability. There's a lot of peer pressure. That frontal lobe is not fully developed yet. And so students can struggle with things like impulse control and needing to find ways to control those impulses in difficult environments, knowing that they want to sleep in, but they need to get to class, and kind of having to face these challenges while making this transition to living on their own, right? So what's going on in terms of those transitional struggles? We know that there's some not so great psychological characteristics associated with the transition to college. So not everybody, but a large portion of students will report homesickness, depression that maybe they had not shown before, and a dissatisfaction with the college environment in that first semester into college. There are things that you can do to buffer that. If a student feels a lot of self-compassion, then that kind of lowers the bar on some of these negative experiences. And if they have good relationships, including a good attachment with their parents, that might kind of ease the struggles that they're facing. But on the other side of things, things can go badly wrong. For instance, there's talk of a culture of poverty where certain groups of individuals who have faced all of these hardships earlier in life are now facing even more advanced challenges as they move into the college environment. Now, all of that is on a good day, right? And COVID happened, and it created a lot of difficulties, particularly going back to that fall 2020 semester where there was a lot of uncertainty about what was going on. So students were worried. They didn't feel like they belonged in the college environment because they weren't getting the traditional experience. They weren't able to socialize, and they were more likely to drop out when they faced these difficulties. And then on top of that, there were the general difficulties in day-to-day life that students were facing, housing insecurity, financial hardships due to decreases in employment during this time. Lots of stuff was happening. And again, certain groups were disproportionately impacted. And so originally, back in 2020, I was wanting to look into how we could counteract these struggles and how we could support our students through those times and beyond, which brings in part 2 of the study, is the beyond part. But how could we help students to learn despite all of these things that were getting in the way? So the purpose of this study was to look at factors that were influencing student learning. So what was going on within the student themselves and what was going on in the institution. And again, part 1 of this data was collected fall 2020, and part 2 of the data collection is underway right now, spring 2023. It's stalled out pretty well, so you're getting a pretty close to final version of the data right now. But let's start with part 1. So fall of 2020, we had 125 students take an online survey through the Zona participant management system, and they reported on a whole lot of characteristics of their learning experience, of their personal characteristics, of their personal preferences, and so on and so forth. As is wont on our campus, the majority of the participants were female and Caucasian, but one area where this swung heavily towards one demographic is exactly what we wanted. They were also primarily freshmen, which is what we wanted to be able to look at specifically the transition into those college years. And so we collected from these students in this survey demographic information, some information about their classroom preferences. So admin kept telling us students want in-person classes, but I hadn't heard it from the students yet. So do you want in-person classes? Do you want online classes? Where are your classes actually being held this semester? So on and so forth. And then in terms of factors that were more unique to the student themselves, looking into locus of control. Do you have a more internal or external locus of control? Self-regulation, because that was so predictive of a positive transition into college. And then study habits. So are you looking at more surface learning or more deep learning? I'll go just a little bit more in depth about each of these things. So first, the demographics, it was mostly to see who we're dealing with. Is this representative of the campus population? Are there big factors in their demographics that are predicting different patterns than what we would expect from the overall student population, so on and so forth? Okay. And then, do they want those physical classes? Do they want online classes? Do they want some mixture of both? What's going on there? And then what do their actual classes look like? Locus of control, if you're not familiar with it, there is a scale by Rotter that looks at kind of where you believe the things in your life that are happening to you are coming from. So if you have an internal locus of control, you believe that you are in control of the situation. If you have an external locus of control, you believe that things are just kind of happening to you. And I was really interested in including this particular measure because I accidentally collected some data in the spring of 2023 that suggested that, oh, people's locus of control was becoming more external. They believed that the world was just happening to them pre-COVID versus those first lockdowns in March 2020. So I wanted to see, is that still the case? Is that locus of control becoming more external? And if so, what's that related to? Is this impacting them in some way? Self-regulation is a concept near and dear to my heart. My majority of my research and my research background is in working with children, looking at their self-regulation, 3, 4, and 5-year-old children. What predicts how well able they are to regulate their behavior, regulate their emotions, regulate the words that are coming out of their mouth, all of these things. And it's a big, broad estimate of what is going on in a person. And so I really like looking at it in the adolescent and early adulthood population as well. Study habits, we wanted to see from a few different directions, how much have they studied in the past, and do they expect to study more or less in that fall 2020 semester? But also, what kind of studying are they doing? Are they studying for a level of shallow processing, just learning like basic definitions, basic surface characteristics of things, or are they looking for a level of deep processing? Are they really trying to understand the interconnections between different concepts that they're learning, thinking about big picture applications, that sort of thing? And in fall of 2020, the news seemed pretty good. They expected to study more than they had in previous semesters. They expected for their GPAs to go up by the end of the semester. But on the not so great side of things, they expected to socialize less than they had in previous semesters. And even though they reported being enrolled in a high number of virtual classes, they weren't happy with it. They wanted the in-person classes. So kind of breaking that down a little bit more, I think these GPAs especially are really promising. So these students are coming in, they have on average 3.59 GPAs. They think they can push it up to a 3.65 by the end of the semester. That's great. In previous semesters, so previous to fall of 2020, they said that they were studying on average around 17 hours a week. And they said, I think this semester we're going to study 18 hours a week. We also measured it in a second way. So this Likert type scale of how much do you think you're going to study this semester, reaching from 1 equals much less to 5 equals much more. And they said it's going to be a 3.61. So that's leaning towards more hours during that semester than previous semesters. Not surprisingly, they didn't think that they were going to socialize as much as previous semesters. Same Likert type scale. Being under that 3 means that they're leaning towards fewer hours of expected socialization. They reported preferring physical classes, but only about half of their classes were on campus that semester. For better or worse, that surface learning and that deep learning were roughly equally preferred. And then they showed some pretty promising patterns of high self-regulation, but they had an external locus of control, which theoretically makes sense. A lot of life had been happening to them, and they were feeling like things were a little bit out of their control. What interested me was how it all related to itself. So all of these variables were interrelated, and there are a lot of patterns that you could pick and choose from to try to dig more in depth. But I'd kind of like to focus on that self-regulation piece. Self-regulation is where my passion is. And it seems to be in fall 2020, the big predictor of how well people were doing. So if you were high in self-regulation, you had a more internal locus of control, which meant that you felt that you were more in control of what was happening to you. You were less likely to dig into that surface learning, more likely to dig into the deep learning of everything. You had a higher expected GPA. And then one measure that I neglected to tell you about was I was asking about how much are you using your phone in class and how much are you getting distracted by it. If you had high self-regulation, you were less likely to be involved in those undesirable cell phone activities during class. So it seemed like supporting student self-regulation was kind of the key to helping them out. So I'm going to let Erin jump in here and tell me how accurate we were and the thoughts that we were having about how everything was interrelated and the piece that self-regulation played, and why she thinks that students were socializing less and being optimistic about their high GPAs and all of that through that lived experience.
Okay, so one of the biggest things that me and Dr. Joyce were discussing when we were talking about like my student perspective was like me personally. I was a sophomore, fall 2020. So I had already experienced 1 year of college, 1 year of, I had already experienced that transition from my high school to my university. So when I was going over these and trying to come up with what like my input was and what I thought some of the reasonings were for this, I tried to put in like my input, and I also tried to put myself in those freshman shoes and trying to see if maybe how they felt or how they would feel as well. So like she said, like Dr. Joyce said previously, some of these are a little more obvious than others. So for like example, obviously during COVID, people were under lockdown in isolation. So obviously you're going to socialize less. I think that's pretty much a given there. I think studying more personally, I feel like it's also sort of like a given. I feel like a lot of these students felt like they were being just thrown into an unknown world. They didn't know it was coming. They didn't know what to expect. Not only freshmen, but like I said, me personally, as a sophomore, I had never done online learning. So I think administrators, faculty, students as a whole just kind of didn't know what to expect. And so they felt like they needed to apply themselves more and increase their study habits, just to, make sure that they were still keeping up with their studies and being able to just stay in that routine, that good academic routine that they have. And I think as a result of that, those increasing studying habits and studying more is also going to that's what influences having the high GPAs, even though, you're still in this like unforeseen, unknown situation that has just been thrown at you. If you're increasing your study habits and continuously just, trying to put more effort in to make sure you can stay intact and stay on track with what you're doing and what you need to get done, that would obviously have an increase and result in having a higher GPA. I think external locus of control is also a very obvious perspective. I think my ideas on it are sort of just like I said, it was something unknown. You had heard talk about it. You had heard discussion about schools going online. You had heard discussion about classes going online, but nobody really knew if it was going to happen or not, or what to expect. I just felt like I was being thrown in a situation that I didn't really know what was going to come of it, how school was going to continue, if we were going to continue. Me personally, like I said, I had some classes, transitioned to online. In some classes, I had some professors where they were just like, I'm not ready for this. I don't know how to accommodate you all. Your grade now is what it will stay, and class is over. And so I just felt like all these things were impacting me that I had really no control of. So I'm not shocked that people, reporting that things were happening to them as opposed to having that control of what they could be in control in and what they could do for themselves. In regards to high self-regulation, my perspective is that, even though you had that external locus of control, you're trying to more self-regulated because, like I said, in relates to studying more, you're trying to stay intact. You're trying to stay on track. You're trying to keep yourself motivated, keep yourself in pace, I guess, the best you can with what you've been given, in relations to assignments, in relations to homework, in relations to being able to get on class and be attentive and just try to do as best as you can as you were before. So that also wasn't a shock to me. That also was, like I said, that also wasn't a shock to me, just because I feel like people felt like they needed to be more self-regulated just to be on track. The dissatisfaction with online classes, I don't know many people who were satisfied with online classes. Me personally, I was not. I felt like I wasn't getting the whole experience, the whole learning experience that I needed. And one of the big things that I brought up when me and Dr. Joyce were, talking about this was that I just feel as if some classes can't be taught online. So I think that has a lot to do with dissatisfaction. One of my biggest things was I had taken an anatomy course. I had to take an anatomy course online, and I did not do well. But in person, I retook it when we came back, and it was just fine. So I think that has a lot of dissatisfaction, just how well your faculty and your professors can accommodate to you, and how well they were able to transition their material and the way they taught their classes as well. I think it's really important also to discuss the fact that not only were students going through this, faculty and administrators were as well. And it was also really difficult on them, just to be like, hey, it's totally your responsibility to move everything you've ever known about teaching in this and throw it online and help these students the best you can. So I think students as well as faculty and administrators were all dissatisfied with those online classes. And then just the last thing was the surface and deep learning. I think that deep learning was increased here. And I think that would make sense because you were, I think it also relates to all the studying more and the self-regulation and the high GPA. It all connects in some way. Because like I said, you're trying to put forth yourself more to make sure you can stay on track. So it makes sense to me that students would engage in more deep learning to make sure that they're obtaining all the information they can with the resources they've been given, the material they've been given. And I don't think that surface learning would have sufficed to make sure that you've, soaked up all the information that you can to be successful in your studies. So that's my perspective on it. If anyone else is a student though, and they have an input, I would love to hear it, because we talked for I think me and Dr. Joyce talked for a good hour and a half about all of this, about from my perspective as well as hers as a faculty member. So
Great job, Erin. You've got fantastic points here. And unfortunately, they seem to be pointing to, hey, maybe we didn't do a great job of meeting students' needs. So that emergency remote instruction that was happening spring 2020, it was rough. We didn't know what was coming. But fall 2020, we should have figured it out just a little bit, right? But there was still a lot left to be desired. So I wanted to dig in more and see, have we figured it out now? Have we had enough time now to try to make things a little bit more of a positive picture? And that's where part 2 comes from. So this is data that's currently being collected. Right now, we're up to 73 participants. So admittedly, not as many as in the fall 2020 semester, but we're getting there. It's 73 participants, still roughly the same demographics, primarily female, primarily Caucasian, primarily freshmen, so that we can get students at this transition into college. Same methods as before, collected on all of the same measures. And I've got some results here for you. And on each of these slides, I have tried to include a little bit of what we had before and where we are now. So on the left, you've got what was going on in fall of 2020, that they were studying more, socializing less, expected higher GPAs, and weren't super happy with their online course offerings. Over here on the right is what's happened this semester. This semester, students are largely reporting the same thing, with a little caveat on that study more that we'll get into. But also the good news that they're expecting to socialize more. So they expect that they're going to be able to get out, spend some time with peers, potentially increase those feelings of belongingness from that. So down on the bottom is where we were in fall of 2020. Up here on the top left is where we are today. Those GPAs are still expected to be relatively high and increasing by the end of the semester, but you'll notice they've dropped a little bit from fall 2020. So fall 2020, they were at around a 3.6. Now they're closer to a 3.4. So they experienced a little bit of a drop there. The strangest thing in this data set is next, that they sort of expect to study more hours. So that the ways in which they were studying were measured through multiple variables. One of the variables was looking at that 1 through 5 Likert scale. So do you expect to study much less or much more? In fall of 2020, they said, well, it's kind of closer to much more. It's more. And this semester, they say, oh, it's going to be even more than that. Now they've moved up to a 4.31 on a 5-point scale. But oops, if you look at the hours that they're studying, it was 14.88 in previous semesters and expected to be 14.15 this semester. That's a big drop from the 17 and 18 from fall 2020. They do expect to socialize more. That's good news. They still prefer those physical classes and are mostly enrolled in those physical classes, but not entirely. So many have opened up their boundaries from pre-COVID times to try out online classes. Potentially, we're doing a better job teaching actual online classes rather than this emergency remote stuff. Surface and deep learning is still roughly the same, but they're leaning more towards that surface learning. They still have high self-regulation, but it's down just a smidge, and their locus of control is about where it was. So still leaning towards that external locus of control side. So good news, bad news there. I see a question that popped up in the chat. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, so I'll read it out loud here. I'm so curious how high schools shutdowns affected these results. In Arizona, one school district that was located in an underserved area was virtual for an entire year. Another school district located about 30 minutes away in a more affluent area was virtual, maybe for 6 weeks. I feel like those students had vastly different preparation for college itself. I would strongly agree. Yeah. In our area, schools weren't shut down for very long. It was mostly business as usual in that fall semester. It was just that spring that was impacted. So they missed a lot of milestones if they were in that transitioning to college fall 2020 cohort. Missed prom, missed graduation, lots of stuff like that, but didn't stay home for a long time. Based off of our limited experience, that we're just focused on those who weren't out for a long time, this data makes sense to me. Okay, they're ready to socialize. They're coming in with some plans to figure out how to study. Maybe things haven't drastically changed. But I would agree, I bet you if we were dealing with data from students who went through that drastically different college experience, that this would all look very different. Yeah, very good point. Again, I like to look at the intercorrelations of everything. I really wanted self-regulation to be super duper predictive of things like it was before. And a lot of those correlations kind of fell apart. So self-regulation was predictive of deep learning, of that expected GPA. One data point that I don't have on here is the current GPA was correlated with self-regulation at 0.91. So really strong correlation between that current GPA and their self-reported self-regulation, and less likely to use their cell phone when they had that self-regulation. But it's not as clear of a picture as it was in fall 2020, which is that data on the right there. Is self-regulation the key? It seemed like it in fall of 2020. Now it seems like it's getting some of it, but not all of it. So I'll let Erin in to talk about what she thinks is going on there.
So, back to my student perspective on just like I said before, I feel like also some of these are the more obvious result as well. So we're back to some sort of normalcy now in spring 23, depending on the area you live in. Socializing more, I think that that's one of the more obvious ones. Everybody's been on lockdown and in isolation for so long. People are ready to get back out there. And I also wanted to bring up the fact that when me and Dr. Joyce were discussing this, I actually asked her, socializing as in terms of like just out in the world, out in the area, or like socializing more within your classroom, because I think it's important to point out that a lot of socialization wasn't happening when you're meeting on Zoom, but when you're in person and you're able to see your classmates and your peers and your professor face to face, I think it is a lot easier and a lot more beneficial to the student to be able to have those connections and be able to socialize with their fellow students around them to improve, like, share notes, share study habits, share this, share that. And I think it's important that y'all can all just kind of like build off of each other. So I think this is a very good component that was a very good result that happened here. Preferring physical classes and having the ability to take them now is actually a very interesting one for us. Like I said, I think all along people have preferred physical classes, but I do think there's a fair majority who report that they do prefer physical classes, but they maybe have enjoyed the online just a little too much, and they kind of maybe, just are like, ugh, I don't want to go to class, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, it doesn't surprise me that people still prefer physical classes because it's it's more like a sense of freedom. It makes you feel like you have more control over the things that you're doing and the things that you can do, as a result of how the world's gotten back to a sense of normalcy. So studying more, I'm going to jump over here real quick. So studying more than previous semesters, but still less than pre-COVID. I think this makes sense because I feel like, especially like I said, I'm trying to think of those freshmen who have only ever experienced COVID learning, especially like in college, especially from making, they were in high school when it happened, they were all COVID learning, all online learning, then they came into college that way, and that's how they've been. So they haven't really experienced, they never got to experience that normal college semester or normal college year. And so I think that my biggest opinion on that is just that maybe they feel a little stressed and a little overwhelmed at the fact that maybe they haven't had that experience before. And so they feel just like we did, students who, were used to a normal college semester transitioning to online. I feel like these freshmen who hadn't maybe feel a little bit overwhelmed, and they feel like they need to apply themselves more because it's a whole different ball field now that you're back in person and you're back to some sort of normalcy. So moving on to the next was talking about more surface learning and less deep learning. I think that this is more of a result of people thinking that maybe online learning, COVID learning was the toughest of it, and that maybe now, they've got the hang of that, they're back in person, and they think that maybe it'll be just a little bit easier, a little bit more relief than before. And I think maybe they're just trying to suffice and make it through, because like another perspective on that could be that they're so burnt out from all that deep learning, all of the putting in the extra effort. And so now they're just trying to suffice to make it through that one quiz, that one exam, that one assignment. And they're just trying to retain the information long enough to get through what they have to do at that point, and not, I think that could be burnout could be the biggest predictor of this result right here. I also thought it was interesting that they were still reporting, my screen's a little cut off, high self-regulation, but still an external locus of control. I think for me, what this means to me is that I especially felt like getting back to, even when we came back to school, it was a sense of normalcy, but not completely back to normal. I don't know if anything ever will go back to normal. We just have, I feel like we've adapted so much that it's kind of hard, and nobody really knows what everybody's sense of normal is different when it comes to post-pandemic learning. So I feel a little bit more in control now that I've come back to what I started when I was a freshman, when I came to college, but also at the same time, I feel like I don't have full control over everything that's going on, everything that's happening to me with school and assignments, just because I feel, like I said, I just feel like it's not completely normal. It's kind of like a hybrid situation maybe, where you do have control over some things, but also at the same time, everybody's adapting in their own way at their own pace, and you don't have full control over everything. But like I said, that's just my personal perspective. And then over here, we have external locus of control associated with less deep learning. My thoughts on this were just that things happening to you, it kind of goes hand in hand with the more surface learning as opposed to the less deep learning. So I'm drawing a blank. Things happening to you can make you feel sometimes like you don't want to put as much effort into it. Maybe, like I said, you revert to more surface learning just to make it suffice. You put in so much effort here previously that now, you feel some sort of relief. You're kind of just I just want to take a step back and not put forth that much effort. The last thing here that I wanted to address was the self-regulation not being as predictive of study habits as before. Me and Dr. Joyce were both talking about this, and we were both a little puzzled by this. And the only thing that maybe we could think of from both standpoints is maybe burnout. That's the only explanation that we could come up with. But if anybody else has some input on this, I would love to hear it, because I'm sure, like I said, all of these are just my perspective, but everybody has their own like experience through COVID and pre-COVID, post-COVID, that everybody, like, it was brought up, that question in the chat about how so many people did so many things different ways. So everybody has their own experience. So if anyone else has a perspective, I would love to hear it, especially if you're a student and what you experienced through this time.
Great work, Erin. Erin's got a little bit more for us in just a moment on the ways in which we could better support students, but I wanted to break in here and address a question in the chat. It says more of a comment than a question. I work mostly with transfer and mid-career adult students, so I'm trying to see what I might be able to extrapolate to this different population. While older students might be expected to have more experience with self-regulation, I'm curious as to whether they also shifted to a stronger external locus of control. It might help us to understand why our retention numbers have declined over the second 2 years of the pandemic more than in the first. It's a great thought. It's frustrating to see enrollment decline in a lot of areas, retention declining at the same time. What do you do? I have not looked into that in this data set, but you're making me think of a different related data set that I ran yesterday. And I found that the older adults, so our non-traditional students, were experiencing more self-regulation, which is good. People are improving their self-regulation over time. I did not see a difference in their locus of control. So age was unrelated to locus of control, which makes me think that, kind of extrapolating it back to this data set, that yeah, they're switching to that more external locus of control too. It's feeling out of control for a lot of people, and that can be contributing to feelings of burnout, feelings of, hey, maybe I need to take a break and focus on all of these other things. And we still do have all of those insecurities and vulnerabilities that emerged with that COVID pandemic, financial insecurities, the loss of social support. A lot of stuff is going on to contribute to this negative experience for a lot of students. And I would imagine it's exacerbated in that older age group who may have had more responsibilities when all of this came in. Erin, I know we're short on time, so I don't want to cut you off. I'll switch you to your next slide over here. And you can tell us a little bit more about what you wish the supports would have been in your place.
Okay. So what we were talking about is, when we were going through my student perspective, me and Dr. Joyce, I also asked her a few questions about how she felt as a faculty member or an administrator with all this being thrown at her. So we were talking about what we could have done for each other. And I think, coming from my point of view, I think more experience and less chaos. I think, like I said, it was all just thrown. It was all back and forth for a little while, and nobody really knew what was going to happen, what was going on, until one day they were all just like, hey, class next week online, and I feel like it was very chaotic, and I think it was just a very hard impact on everyone. And I think it would have been a lot more of a beneficial transition if there was more communication, and especially more understanding between faculty and students. Like, I feel like maybe as a student, I at times felt like faculty didn't have quite the grip on like what they were doing, and that's understandable. So I think it's important. I think it would have been important for everyone to understand, like, all the way around, that it was difficult on everyone, and that you just needed support and communication. The next point I brought up was more interaction and encouragement for interaction. This was a big one for me. It relates back to how I spoke on the last slide about like socializing more within your classroom and with your peers and students. I felt like when we got online, it was just, hey, here's this PowerPoint slide, and just like nobody was paying attention. It wasn't very engaging. Maybe more, especially on Zoom, like breakout rooms or more opportunities for class discussion or the same opportunities for class discussion that you would get in an in-person room. I felt like I wasn't offered those. And then the next point I brought up was more opportunities for change in reaction to the changes that were going on around us. So I feel like maybe not everybody was as accommodating. So there's also, this goes hand in hand. I was just going to say with the leniency and the understanding is that, not everybody had the access to the internet. Not everybody has the access to be, as attentive. Like when you're at home, maybe you have children, maybe you have pets, maybe you have family members that need taken care of. Everyone's situation is different. And I feel like it was like an all in or an all out kind of situation. And there wasn't much accommodating or leniency or understanding from both ends. So I think all of these factors were very important and would have been very helpful to not only students, but like I said, it goes both ways to the faculty as well.
Fantastic. Thank you, Erin. I see even more discussion in the chat. This is fantastic. With regards to your comments on communication, I bet that was even more enhanced if a faculty member wasn't super communicative to begin with. Oh my goodness, yes. Right? There are definitely a lot of challenges that happen in communication, and if you weren't prepared to communicate well in these new environments, it could be a struggle. I'm aware of our time. We're very close on things, and I want to allow us some more time for discussion at the end of all of this. So I think I'm going to give you the 30-second version of how do we fix it all. I wish we had more time. Erin, if you don't mind dropping a link in the chat, you can see these slides so that you can look at some of the resources later in case they're helpful to you, and we'll have a QR code on that last slide. But basically what I'm hearing in all of this is we need to be bolstering students' self-regulation and study habits and sending them in a positive direction in that way. And there's a lot of different ways that we can do this. Giving them opportunities to practice their self-regulation can be helpful, because self-regulation is like a muscle, right? You work it and you work it, and it gets stronger so that you're able to take on bigger challenges as you move forward. Thank you, Erin. Providing scaffolding where we can, in-person classes, virtual classes, both helpful, but it can be difficult to try to think through what that scaffolding might look like. I've included here a template for scaffolding that was given to me by our Faculty Development Center here on campus that I found to be incredibly helpful, particularly in that very first bit. What's in it for you? So that students can see right at the very beginning, okay, why am I doing this assignment? It's not just a thing to mark off my to-do list. Providing opportunities for collaboration can be helpful. Students give a lot of pushback on collaborative opportunities, but if you can make them low stakes and more voluntary, I've found that that can be helpful. So having discussion boards that are sometimes more social in nature than they are academic, that can get conversations going, improve communication, improve sense of belonging, collaborative assignments that they don't necessarily have to do, like coming up with a Google Doc with group notes, having opportunities for students to interact in a positive way and be helpful as long as it stays low stakes. I'm sorry that we don't have a whole lot of time for discussion here, but I do want to open it up to any questions that anybody has. And I do want to let you know that these slides are available to you should you want to reference them. Thank you all for being here today. I really appreciate it, and I enjoy the conversation. Thank you all.
Yes, such good comments in the chat, and it's so great to have your perspective as well as Erin's student perspective. Such a good session. I'm going to stop recording now and kick everybody out.